Welcome to the VBAC Homebirth Stories podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Winning, founder of the Motherhood Circle and creator of the Journey into Motherhood program. I'm a mother of two and have had two unplanned and unneeded C-sections and am planning my first home and vaginal birth. My own journey has sparked a deep passion to support women to find their own voice and strength to create the pregnancy, birth and motherhood experience you desire. This podcast is for women wanting to learn more about VBACs, especially home births, and for professionals who want to learn more about how to support VBAC home birthing women. Inside, we're going to share women's stories from surgical birth to achieving their vaginal home birth after cesarean. Now let's get started. Hey, me again. I just wanted to let you know that I've just created a brand new Facebook group called VBAC Homebirth Support Group, where you can connect with other like-minded mothers who are looking to have a VBAC home birth as well. You can find the link in the show notes, and I look forward to seeing you there. Hi, Melanie. Thank you so much for coming on today and talking to us. I'm really excited to have you on because I've been a bit of a stalker for a couple of months since I came across you and your YouTube channel, and also I recently found that you're involved in creating a book and also writing a thesis. Please introduce yourself and let us know more about you.
Yeah, hi Ashley. So my name's Melanie Jackson. My kind of online platforms are all listed as Melanie the Midwife. So if you're looking for anything about me, you Google Melanie the Midwife, it'll probably come up. But I am a private midwife, and I have been for my entire career. So this would be my 11th or 12th year of supporting women to give birth at home. So I'm a registered midwife. And I have two kids. One is 3 and one's 7, and they were both born at home here I live in the Blue Mountains in New South Wales in Australia. And I have also completed a PhD, which is called Birthing Outside the System. And I spoke with women who have either chosen to have a free birth, which is giving birth at home without a trained health professional, or to have a home birth with already identified risk factors. So these are two choices that are considered completely outside the system. So I spoke with those women and wrote a PhD about what motivates that choice. And since then, I've had a few academic publications that have come out of that research, and also co-authored a book called Birthing Outside the System, Canary in the Coal Mine. And that was a collaborative effort from a lot of different authors who've written on a very similar topic to birth outside the system. And it's a beautiful book. I think it's got about 50 other contributors. So it's really extensive and a great resource. So that's what's been happening recently. And I also work part-time at Western Sydney University as a midwifery researcher. And I usually just focus on individual projects, and I'm involved in those. So at the moment, we're doing a study on birth in the time of COVID and how that's impacted women. What else do we do in our week?
I don't think you can fit anything more in,
oh,
Melanie.
Sorry. Okay, that's it. That's me.
Well, it sounds like you have been spending the last decade, really supporting women and involved in, birthing with women and this sort of thing. So obviously you're very passionate, and I'm really interested to hear actually why you decided to do your thesis on, why women are choosing free birth, or why women end up free birthing as a starting point, just as an interest point.
Yeah. Well, partly when you start a PhD, you particularly look for topics that have not been researched. That's the idea of research, is to fill gaps in knowledge. And what I noticed is that no one in Australia had thought to research the topic of free birth or birth outside the system, outside of what's considered safe and normal. So that was big. And because I was already a home birth midwife, I had a lot of access to the home birth and free birth community. And I knew where to find these women who would be able to share their stories. So that was probably the motivation, is that I was going to do research. There was already a lot done in home birth and low risk home birth, but there wasn't a lot of research about women who are choosing home birth with risk factors and who are not planning on having anybody there. And I found a great Hannah Darlin is my PhD researcher, and she's who I work with now at Western Sydney Uni. So she was really supportive, and we went for it.
Awesome. And obviously you've created a book now that follows through from that. So what was something that was really interested in you for you to find out once you were doing that paper?
Yeah, so when I, finishing the thesis, the main finding was that for themselves, they look at the full big picture of their whole family life and their own and their baby's life, and choose what they believe will be best and safest. So what we found is that women who choose to give birth outside the system are doing it because they genuinely believe that birthing in that way is safer than the other option of giving birth in a hospital.
Okay. And I found that interesting as well. Well, I understood that as well. So now we're going to take it even more niche. We're going to go even further into your research and your experience of why women choose free birth for their VBAC, their vaginal birth after cesarean.
So there was a few reasons. Firstly, they find it hard. So women, they've already usually had a negative experience in hospital. So whether or not that was with their previous cesarean birth, that they were just feeling so traumatized by, they can't bring themselves to go back to hospital. And sometimes that trauma then takes them on a journey to start exploring what their other options are, because they want to have more babies, but they're frightened of a hospital and they have a genuine psychological fear of going back there. So if they want more babies, they need to consider what their other options are. So then they start looking, and then they find the option of home birth VBAC, and they think, oh, okay, I could probably do that. And then they start searching, and quite possibly they might discover that there's not enough midwives in their area that are actually close to them to be able to support them to have a HBAC, a home birth VBAC. Or there are midwives around, but the midwives have chosen not to support VBAC at home. And so then women are already down in this investigative process, finally deciding that they don't want to go to hospital, but there is an option to give birth at home, but then discovering that they can't actually find anybody to support them. So what I found in my research is that usually women who were free birthing, there was only a few who genuinely felt like being completely on their own was the best and safest. But the majority of women who chose free birth actually would have preferred to have a midwife with them. That was their first choice, was midwife with them at home, because they felt that would be safest. But then failing that, they had to choose the next best option. And the next best option didn't become defaulting back into the hospital. It became free birth. And so these women talked about feeling forced to choose free birth, and they chose it because they thought it was a better option than going to hospital. But actually what they really wanted was to have a midwife support them at home. So yes, the main sort of thrust of why women choose VBAC and have to have a free birth and a VBAC is that it's the next best option when they see what is available to them, rather than, but a lot of them would have preferred to have a midwife.
And listening to that for the first time, if you'd never heard of free birth or you never even considered it, because obviously, 99% of the population go to hospital to have a baby. Is that right in Australia?
Yeah, it's something like 1.5% end up outside of hospital for some reason, either home birth or free birth or accidentally giving birth.
Yeah. So in our culture, in Australian culture, because I know it's different around the world in European countries, where they have much more support and help to, have a home birth with a midwife. But here in Australia, it's very much hospital birthing. And so that would seem, I'm going to say it would sound quite crazy to someone to think a woman's choosing to birth on her own at all, rather than go to the hospital. So are you happy, or do you have the experience to dig a little bit deeper into just how they must be really feeling inside. Like, it's not just a fear of the hospital or the birth. It's a real fear of what's happening in that environment, where they just feel that they're not going to be able to successfully have a vaginal birth, or they're going to be bullied, or they're going to be ridiculed. What are some of the obstacles that the women are facing if they choose to go back into that system?
Yeah. I mean, it's all those things that you talked about. So women usually have already experienced what they think they're going to experience again in hospital. They've already experienced practitioners that don't listen to them, or that talk down to them, or they've already felt a lack of support from their birth support team. They've already felt traumatized by being assaulted, where the practitioner has done interventions on them that they did not consent to. So they've already had an experience of the hospital system that was traumatic. So they expect that when they go back there for their VBAC, they're going to get the same, but quite possibly worse, because a lot of hospitals are frightened of VBAC. They feel like it's an incredibly high risk situation. And so women who are choosing VBACs, their choices are given these really tight boundaries. So they, for example, will limit the amount of hours that they will allow, in inverted commas, that they will allow women to labor for. So if a woman is not laboring according to the hospital time schedule, then if she's had a VBAC, she's a lot more likely to have another cesarean, just because she hasn't been given enough time to actually labor as she would normally. So women are aware that if they go to hospital for a VBAC, there's going to be more restrictions upon them than a woman who's going in planning a vaginal birth without a previous cesarean. So that,
it's just it's exactly right. That was my experience as well. Actually, I was being pushed into a repeat cesarean after 6 hours of labor. And I'd only been at the hospital for a few hours, and I was already 8 centimeters dilated. It's almost like unbelievable to be able to explain just how pressurized that can be. And you shared some really interesting information on VBAC after multiple cesareans the other day, which was quite a popular post on your Facebook page.
Yeah.
And if healthcare providers actually explained it the way that you had explained it on your page or with that graphic, it would be different. When they're talking to you, they're saying, every time you see them, but what about a uterine rupture? Do you know the risks? Do you know the risks? Well, yeah, I do know the risks, and it's this percentage. And then they're like, oh, okay, so you know the risks. And I'm like, well, yeah, do you know the risks of a repeat cesarean? Are we going to talk about that? What exactly did you share? Do you remember the percentage for, vaginal birth after multiple cesareans?
Yeah, so there's some great research, and Hazel Keedle also has some excellent information on this. But what I posted was a study by Landon done in 2006, and there are some newer studies, but VBAC after multiple cesareans results in no rupture 99.1% of the time. So Landon found that in 0.09% is the risk factor for rupture for women who have had multiple cesarean sections.
So this 2% that's kind of flying around isn't even correct, that I hear all the time for a second cesarean.
No, 2% seems high to me. It does increase if the risk of VBAC, of a rupture, does increase if women are induced. So the lowest risk for rupture is if a woman just goes into labor spontaneously and isn't augmented with syntocinon, or what they call pitocin in America. If there's no augmentation or induction procedures done, that reduces the risk of rupture. But certainly as you start to increase induction interventions, the risk increases of rupture. So certainly for women who are looking to reduce the risk of rupturing, then avoiding sort of unnecessary induction processes would be one way that you could make the VBAC process safer. But I think that there's a lot of fear and misunderstanding for hospital practitioners. They don't realise how little the risk is, because I think for a long time they've been told that it's risky because of uterine rupture. And in fact, there are other risks to VBAC that nobody talks about, like the potential for an increase in blood loss or hysterectomy and all these other things that, there's still other risks there, but we keep focusing on uterine rupture. And so, I think, the relative risk for uterine rupture, for women who've had multiple cesareans is less than 1%. And if a woman feels comfortable with that risk and is willing to take that risk, then she should be allowed to. It shouldn't be the job of the practitioner to tell a woman what is too risky, what is a too big a risk for her to take. Like, that's her choice.
And what about, I was speaking with a woman yesterday who was told her baby was going to be enormous, 12 to 13 pounds at birth, and that increased the rupture risk of 1 in 2. Have you ever heard of a big baby causing a huge increase in rupture rate at all?
So did they tell her that she'd have a 50% chance of rupturing with a bigger baby?
Yes.
Oh, I can't imagine. I mean, I've not seen any research about it, but it sounds like an inflated risk, interpretation of the risk. I don't think anybody can actually predict that kind of thing. No.
And we haven't got any studies at the moment for, larger babies or anything like that for VBAC, hey?
Well, I haven't delved into the specific topic of bigger babies for VBAC, but my intuition on that would be that 50% is highly unlikely.
Yeah.
If I find a study, I will absolutely backpedal on that. But
And what are some of the other things? I was just thinking, because I'm pregnant at the moment, so I've been in pregnancy groups, and there's a lot of women who want to VBAC, but a lot of them are saying, I'll do it if I'm allowed to. I don't want to risk the safety of my baby or myself. I'm not going to be negligent. I'm not going to be a hero. This is the messaging they're kind of getting from the OBs that they're kind of seeing, or the healthcare providers in the hospital, who are already planting that seed early on that this is too risky. And so I heard a woman say, well, you can have, the OB said, you can try a VBAC if your baby's no bigger than 7.7 pounds at birth, or you can try a VBAC if you go into labour by 39 or 40 weeks, or, you can try this, you can try that. If there's no other risk involved, which, from what I'm hearing, there's no other risk, but they're being put on these kind of deadlines, is this another reason why women are choosing to, come out of the system so they don't have to feel this pressure of induction, the big baby, the extra growth scans, anything that kind of gets placed on top of a woman that maybe a low-risk woman wouldn't even have to jump through those kind of hoops?
Yeah. I mean, any woman, doesn't matter what her risk factors are or what her health conditions are, wants autonomy in her birth choices. And that's what she should have. What we know, legally, a woman can consent to or decline anything that's offered to her, and it's completely within her rights, even if it results in the death of herself or her baby. She's completely within her rights to make all her care decisions, regardless of the preference of her healthcare provider. So women want that autonomy. And so if their autonomy is challenged, they will either give in and do what their practitioner has told them. And then that's often where trauma comes from, is the, having given in your choices and ended up going along with what was recommended, even though you didn't really feel like that's what you wanted to do. So women often feel traumatized by losing autonomy and control. So, the rhetoric around midwifery and maternity care is that it should be woman-centered and that the woman should have autonomy, and that we are there to support women's choices and help to keep them as safe as we possibly can within their choices. But what's actually happening is that practitioners have decided what each woman should have, and then they put up these barriers and boundaries around particular women based on their risk factors and their history and all that kind of stuff and their own practitioner preferences. And they're not actually tailoring their care to what the woman wants. They're tailoring their care to what they think she should have. And so the problem is that women realize they're not going to get what they want. They're actually going to get what their care provider wants them to have. And then they get out of there and they choose something different. What they think is best, not what their practitioner thinks is best.
And that's sad, isn't it? That, you know, that's happening, because that's not informed consent as I understand it, or, you know, what is promoted in birthing groups or birthing pages. And it does leave women feeling like they have no choice or no support, or, you know, feeling like they're kind of being held against their will to do something they feel is unsafe, which can be very scary. Yeah, I've experienced that myself. Yeah, so I'm glad that you actually said that, because you know, I think that's a huge thing that so many women are experiencing, especially VBAC women. So when you were looking at free birth for VBAC, did you have any in your studies, any outcomes, poor? Were there a higher range of poor outcomes, or did you have that in your study included? What sort of outcomes there were for the women, including mental health, you know, how they were feeling after their birth versus the cesarean, or any deaths or anything like that that came from that? Hey, me again. I just wanted to let you know that I've just created a brand new Facebook group called VBAC Homebirth Support Group, where you can connect with other like-minded mothers who are looking to have a VBAC homebirth as well. You can find the link in the show notes, and I look forward to seeing you there.
Yeah, so the question was about stats, about the outcomes, you know, were there any poor outcomes or anything like that. The study that I did was qualitative, which means we were looking at women's experiences rather than sort of the quantitative data of how many had this and how many had that. One interesting thing that we did discover was that the women who I interviewed for my research, that it was between about 75% of them had postgraduate or university level degrees or higher, which when you compare it to the statistics at the time, 25% of the Australian population fit into that demographic. So what we actually noticed is that women who were choosing birth outside the system were highly educated, very autonomous, very thoughtful, and had a lot of confidence in themselves. So that's the kind of information we were after. So we had this sort of a little bit of statistics about the women, but not necessarily about the outcomes.
Sure. That's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I read recently in Hazel's study, I briefly went over it quickly, and there was a high number of women who were educated as well and had higher incomes as a joint as well. So it was interesting that, you know, women who are quite educated, you know, because there's a thing that you hear that women are going on Google, and you're listening to Dr. Google, have heard it from healthcare providers. And the assumption is that they're making choices that are not really educated or well researched. But I think that a lot of people don't realise just how much research is at our fingertips now with the internet and all these medical journals and studies, and people like you who are sharing this information for us to, you know, really get our hands on.
And what we haven't been told about healthcare providers is that healthcare providers generally do not want to have their authority challenged. So there's a concept called authoritative knowledge. And the idea of authoritative knowledge is that the people in authority have the knowledge that counts and that is respected. So in a Western society, medical knowledge has authoritative knowledge. What happens with women who start to take responsibility over their own choices and to choose things like free birth and home birth? Often they strip their healthcare providers of the power of their authoritative knowledge, and they actually consider themselves, the women themselves consider their own knowledge to be superior to their care providers. And that is upsetting to care providers because, in this culture, we're taught that our knowledge and education and, is authoritative and that we know what's best. So I know what's best, actually, if I'm going to make my own choices, that's really offensive to a healthcare provider. And so then all of a sudden you have healthcare providers not wanting to provide care or calling the women names like that she's being silly or that she's uneducated. And there's all this, lowbrow banter and insulting the women to try and kind of claw back the authority that they believe they should have. But what we know about women who make these choices is that they're actually highly educated. They spend a lot of time investigating, and they have the ability to choose what's right for them.
And that probably explains some of the hostile experiences that many women experience in the system that then leads them to go out of the system, because nobody wants to go somewhere where they're going to be, abused or ridiculed or spoken back to. You're going in there to get the support and the love and someone to kind of hold your hand and make you feel good, which is why we go to midwives, private midwives. So we were actually talking before we started recording. I wanted to talk about the different kinds of midwives, because I thought if I just got myself to the hospital, and because I never saw a midwife through my care, I was always with obstetric care. If I just see a midwife, I'll be saved. And I thought, if I get myself a midwife, I'm going to be safe, because everyone in the birthing industry was talking about how midwives were amazing. But what wasn't disclosed is that every midwife is different, obviously. Everyone has different levels of passion. They've been doing it for longer, different views, and also the difference between a private midwife, a midwife who works in, with an obstetrician in a private hospital, or someone who works in a public hospital and maybe ground down a little bit, versus someone who's going it on their own, an independent midwife who's taking more risks by having her own business. Can we talk about midwives and the difference in between, possible midwives?
Yeah. So all midwives in Australia go through the same training. So it's a university degree, and we all come out as registered midwives. And then you can choose to start, working wherever you like. So a lot of midwives end up working in a public hospital, and there are various programs within public hospitals. So if you have continuity of midwifery care, you might get your own midwife throughout your whole care. But if you go through just the kind of regular standard care, we call it fragmented. And that's because you'll turn up to your clinic day in the antenatal clinic, you'll see whoever's on. And then when you turn up for birth, you'll see a birth unit midwife. And then when you finish giving birth, you'll be cared for by the postnatal ward midwives. So sometimes in hospitals, the care is fragmented because it means the hospital is broken up into different areas, and women get moved between all the different areas and they see different people. So the majority of midwives work within that setting. And some midwives have worked their whole career in birth unit, some their whole career in antenatal, and some just on postnatal. Others might rotate around, but usually they'll have a little niche area that they prefer to be in. So that's one way of working. And midwives who work at hospitals work according to, a set of guidelines that's generally expected of them at a hospital. So they may not have as much autonomy as a midwife, for example, who's working privately. So I work as a private midwife, and I don't have a set of policies or guidelines as to how I should care for women daily. There are some restrictions on what we're allowed to do that we have from kind of externally from our registration bodies about what we're allowed to do as practitioners, but our care is not necessarily prescribed by a set of guidelines. So that's sort of two ways you can work as a midwife. Some midwives work in a private hospital where the women see their private obstetrician, and then when they come to the hospital to give birth, you're cared for by the midwives who work at the private hospital, and then later on your private obstetrician will come in and towards the end and catch the baby and do whatever's needed after that. So that's a few ways that midwives work. And there's varying degrees of autonomy within your work depending on where you are. There are some birth centres where the midwives might have more autonomy and the care is more midwifery led. There's also about 12 to 14 home birth programs, publicly funded home birth programs that are run through hospitals. So midwives might end up working in those as well. But again, they're restricted by what they're allowed to do by their hospital guidelines. And yeah.
That's good to hear and good to understand as well. And I'm just thinking, can you explain from your understanding, you obviously you can't speak for every midwife or, you know, the reasons why, but I have found it extremely hard in some parts of Australia for hearing women get support to home birth after a VBAC with a midwife. Can you shed some light on maybe why that may be the case?
Well, I guess if you think of home birth, from the research, you know, in terms of statistics, we know that women who have very few risk factors, who are, you know, considered low risk, having well healthy babies and are well and healthy themselves, the best outcomes for home birth are for those women. And so when you start diverging from that and adding potential risk factors, the understanding of how that might go is a lot more muddy. Like, we don't have a lot of research about, you know, what will happen if I give birth at home with these particular risk factors. So there's an unknown element where when you start adding risk factors in a home birth setting, you know, you're less you can be less certain about how it's going to go, you know. So there's that element, but there's also, we work within a set of quality and safety guidelines, and also within the Australian College of Midwives guidelines for consultation and referral. So anything that falls out of those guidelines, there is quite, you know, we do a lot of paperwork around that to prove if we should get investigated for our actions, to prove what we've done with that woman, to help educate her about the potential risk she's taking by giving birth at home. So it's called a record of understanding, or it used to be called an Appendix A. And basically, our job as midwives is to give women, or, you know, as private midwives, give our clients as much information as we possibly can so that they can choose what they believe is best. So there's been times where I've had women who have had risk factors or developed risk factors throughout their pregnancy. And I've sort of said to them, look, this is the research on this, and how do you feel about continuing at home versus the option of moving into hospital? And now sometimes look at that research and go, oh yeah, I don't feel comfortable with this anymore. I would like to go to hospital. And you go, great, let's do that, no problem. And, you know, we can navigate it at the time. But I think that the concern about going outside of the guidelines or supporting women who continue to give birth at home when they're outside of the guidelines that we've been given as midwives to work within, there is a fear of being reported to AHPRA, or the Health Complaints Commission, for our actions. And then you have to defend the choices that you've made about your care for this woman. So that's quite frightening to a private midwife, because there's not a lot of, you know, I know midwives who've been reported and they didn't have a lot of faith in the process that AHPRA or the HCCC go through in order to investigate the situations. So a few of the midwives I know, they've just been told to stop practicing while there's an investigation into their actions. And then at the end of 2 or 3 months or even longer, they're told, okay, yeah, go back to work. We found no wrongdoing. You know, you're cleared. However, they stopped that midwife working for 3 months, and she potentially had to find new midwives for these women. She could have had 10 women booked, you know, to give birth in those times where she's all of a sudden not able to care for them. There's a loss of income. The women are disrupted because they've got to find a new midwife. You know, there's all this disruption that happens, and there doesn't seem to be acknowledgement from AHPRA or the HCCC that that is a big deal. And so I think midwives are frightened of that process. And so we really try to not get ourselves in situations that we might be reported for.
And that's understandable. And I think it's really important to know that to know that about, you know, the reason why midwives are making those choices is to protect themselves, because they could effectively lose their salary for 3 months, which is terrible, because if someone's going to be reported, it should be done immediately so they can get back to work and have some sort of protection. To find out 3 months later that everything's okay and, you know, we didn't, you know, we could have done this a bit quicker, but those women can't be supported. They probably have to go to a hospital and have a birth they didn't want to have, or find someone that they maybe not be as connected with as they were with their primary midwife,
Yeah.
which is really sad. So it's good to know that. And also a little bit,
Income earners for
yeah, it's also a little bit,
to think that it's always possible.
Sorry, you're cutting out there, Mel.
Oh, have you got me back?
I can hear you now.
Yeah, cool.
It's also interesting that there hasn't been research, because I always hear home birth is safe for low risk women. Home birth is safe for low risk women. And, you know, I'm not considered a low risk woman in the system, but I do consider myself low risk as a home birthing woman. You know, we discover our risks for ourselves, as you mentioned in your study. But in the system, I'm not considered as low risk. But it's interesting that they haven't taken time to really research the risks for women who are, you know, high risk. Obviously, there's all different types of high risk based on, you know, any medical problems or VBAC, or if you want to call VBAC high risk, high BMI and that sort of thing, because that could possibly change things for midwives and also you know, all different types of women wanting to birth. But I think, do you know anything about birthing in the UK? I think that they support, or they allow women who are higher risk to have a home birth at home. Do you know anything about that?
My understanding of the UK system is that it's a lot more midwifery led, and that women can have home births, like the access to hospital funded, like publicly funded home birth is a lot more broad than in Australia. There are still private midwives, because there are women who will fall outside of their home birth guidelines that still want to have a home birth. So I'm not sure if VBAC is allowed in a public system, but they definitely still have private midwives who would end up picking up the women who don't have access to the publicly funded home birth. But certainly from a philosophical perspective, their model of midwifery care is a lot more evidence-based than what we have here in Australia.
And here in Australia, we do have publicly funded home birth in a small percentage of hospitals, but I don't think they support VBAC. Do you know if they do?
I wouldn't.
So they don't support VBAC. So your only choice is to have a midwife who is working as a private midwife who will support you, or to free birth if you want to have a home birth, basically.
So if you want to have a home birth VBAC, yes, you'll need to find a private midwife who will support you for free birth. Or the other option is obviously to VBAC in hospital in whatever scenario you can work out that's going to be good for you. Some midwifery group practices within hospitals. So if you find a continuity of care midwife, often they will support VBAC. Because but it's done in the hospital, obviously, but it's with a midwife that who you know that has done their care for you for pregnancy. Yeah. And
you support VBAC in home birth, don't you?
So I have, yes, I
have. So when you were supporting those women, what were I'm talking about if there was a uterine rupture, what are some of the things that you're looking for as a midwife when a woman has a VBAC at home?
Yeah, so if I think back to the VBAC situations that I've been with at home, you know, there's a lot of planning that goes into it. So we always talk about the risk of rupture. We always have a really solid transfer plan. So knowing, okay, how far are you from the hospital? How long does it take to get there? You know, who's going to, you know, so the women book into a hospital as well that's closest to them. Then, so we do a lot more fetal monitoring. So listening to the baby's heartbeat is probably every 10 to 15 minutes. We use a Doppler to check that baby's heartbeat is still normal. But when I think back to the signs that I've noticed for women who are having a VBAC, I can recall 2 that we transferred into hospital. And what often happens is if there's something going on with a previous incision site, a woman's body will just stop laboring. It'll kind of go, oh, hang on a second, like we're not feeling good about whatever's happening on the scar or whatever. So for me, there's no waiting. So if a woman's having a VBAC at home and her labor just stops, for me, that's a good enough potential rupture. It's not always, doesn't always mean that you need to have a repeat cesarean. What it might mean is we just need more intense monitoring or more intense supervision over that, and to be in a place that is like to be able to access a cesarean quicker if that's what needs to happen. The other thing that would be far more ominous would be any kind of vaginal bleeding from the vagina, or a change in the baby's heart rate. So I have transferred VBAC before for a change in the baby's heart rate. I've never had a rupture at home, and certainly the times where we've transferred in, they've never actually diagnosed a rupture. But yeah, certainly I think there's a smaller window of, you're watching a lot closer, and any kind of sign of rupture, you're not sort of sitting back and waiting to see what else happens. It's just like, well, this is what I've noticed, and that's one of the signs, and so let's go. So it could be nothing happening at all. She could just be the body having a rest, but there's things that we don't know as practitioners, and that we can't know until afterwards. So if I think back to VBACs, I mean, there's been lots of successful VBACs at home as well, but if I think back to why I would transfer, those are a few of the reasons why I have in the past.
That's good to know. It's good to know what, you're thinking, and, as a practitioner who's supporting VBAC women as well. I think that's pretty much it. I think we've had so much information, but is there anything that you would like to share with the audience that you think is important for this segment?
Yeah, I just think that women need to know that they're completely capable of doing their own research. The internet is just full of valuable research. And so tap into evidence-based resources, speak to midwives, gather as much information as you can, and then you can feel confident in your decisions and know that actually you are the authority in your care, and that nobody is actually allowed legally to tell you what to do or force you into anything. So that would be my top tip.
That's a great top tip. And before you go, I want to talk about this, your course that you've created. Because it's a wonderful course. I snuck into when you were giving the first couple of chapters away, first modules, and I snuck in. I really, really enjoyed it. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so it's a course. It's called Transformative Birthwork, and you can get it at www.transformativebirthwork.com. And basically it came from, I have various professional hats, and I just found that I felt sad that I couldn't support every single woman that wanted to access my care. So I kind of had less time, more demand than I had time. So I thought, how can I give more women information about how to have a transformative birth without actually providing the care myself? So I still do have a client load, but obviously I can't take on everybody who wants me as their midwife. So I put together this package, Transformative Birthwork, and it's got various other health professionals in there. And the idea is that birth is always transformative. So you'll either experience an incredibly positive transformation, or it will not be a positive transformation. So there is always transformation. So women need to go into their birth knowing that they will be changed in some way. But this course is about giving women resources that they can use and access, and things that they can learn to actually improve their chances of having a positively transformative birth, and to actually come out of it feeling joy and elation and so good about themselves, and taking them into their parenting journey with confidence instead of trauma.
Mm.
And so I've interviewed Dr. Rachel Reed, Dr. Sarah Buckley.
Oh, just the best then.
I know, only the best. Dr. Hannah Darlin and Jessie Johnson Cash. And I always add more content. So it's evolving. So the course actually just grows and grows and grows. So you pay for a membership for the year, and there's new information that just gets put in there all the time. So for people who have already found my YouTube channel, Melanie the Midwife on YouTube, the content, the structure is not dissimilar. So there's videos of me presenting and all of the other presenters offering video content, but there's also activities to do, like journaling activities, and there's also written content and downloads. And so, the idea is that we can all access the skills and knowledge that you need in order to curate for yourself a transformative birth that's positive. And there's a whole section in there, which is my favorite, called Power Strategies. And it's about how to hold on to power in the birth space.
That sounds really good, really interesting. And how much is your membership for the year?
So the membership currently sits at about $310, but if you go through, there is a free little webinar series on the website on transformativebirthwork.com. And if you go into there, there's actually a 75% discount at the end of the video.
75% discount?
Sorry, $75 discount.
Oh, 75. I was going to say, you're giving it away.
Oh my gosh. No, not
$75 is very, very helpful and very generous. So yeah, $75 would be awesome.
So it ends up at around $240.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And for a whole year worth of support, information and guidance, do you have a support group or a Facebook group for women to connect with?
Not specifically for transformative birth work, but if they go on to Melanie the Midwife on Facebook, that's where you can engage with the community. And also what the members are invited to do, there's little comment sections throughout the course. And basically I build the course for the members who are there. So if they have a question and go, hey, what about this? I'm like, right, that's our next topic. That's cool. What we're doing. So it's constantly evolving based on what the membership is asking for. So if you go in there and you think, oh, I just haven't found the thing that I really wanted, then you just call out and say, hey, Mel, I'm really interested in this topic. And then I make that my next job.
Awesome. No, that sounds really great. So if you are listening and you have loved listening to Mel and how experienced she is, please jump on and check out her course. I've already done a couple of the chapters and I really, really loved it. And of course, I've watched all of Mel's YouTube videos. I went straight through those. And then I follow Mel on Facebook as well, because she's always sharing evidence-based information. And I'm really enjoying those VBAC ones that you're sharing, Mel, because it's such a great way to hear that information versus the opposite is what we're often told. So thank you so much for all the work that you're doing in this space, and thank you so much for coming on today.
Oh, thanks for having me, and all the best with this amazing podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to the VBAC Homebirth Stories podcast. I hope that this episode has helped you take another step to finding your voice and confidence in your VBAC journey. If you enjoyed the episode, please take a second to rate and review. Each review helps us to help more women to find out more about VBAC Homebirth, just like you. Don't forget to take a screenshot, share it to your Instagram stories, and tag me at the Motherhood Circle. See you next week.